CEO yells at black woman for touching Ferrari. She fixes the engine. Jasmine's grease-stained fingers had fixed engines worth more than most people's houses, but she'd never touched one that would change her life. Before we get deep into the story, please let me know in the comment where you are watching from. Hit subscribe if you are hooked in and ready to enjoy the story. Because tomorrow, I have another beautiful story to share with you, and I do want you to miss it for anything. Now let's get into the story. Jasmine's grease-stained fingers had fixed engines worth more than most people's houses, but she'd never touched one that would change her life. The Miami sun beat down mercilessly on the cracked asphalt of Martinez Auto Shop, where Jasmine Williams crouched beneath the hood of a 1987 Honda Civic that wheezed like an old man climbing stairs. Sweat beaded on her dark skin as she traced the maze of wiring with practiced precision, her calloused hands moving with the confidence of someone who spoke fluent engine. "Compression shot in cylinder 3, she murmured to herself, wiping her hands on coveralls that had seen better decades. At 28, Jasmine possessed the kind of mechanical intuition that couldn't be taught, the ability to diagnose a car's ailments by sound alone. Yet here she was, earning $12 an hour fixing beaters, while her MIT mechanical engineering degree gathered dust in a frame above her studio apartment bed. The shop's owner, Miguel Martinez, emerged from his cluttered office, shaking his head. "Customer says he can't afford the repair. Wants to know if we can just make it run a little longer." Jasmine's jaw tightened. This was the third car this week whose owner couldn't afford proper repairs. She understood the desperation. Her own student loans felt like a weight pressing on her chest, and her mother's medical bills kept piling up despite the insurance that covered almost nothing. But patching problems instead of fixing them went against everything she believed about her craft. "I can jury-rig something," she said quietly, though the words tasted bitter. "But it won't last more than a few months." Miguel nodded grimly. They both knew the dance. Make it work just long enough for people to scrape together money for the real fix, which most never could. Jasmine had started working here straight out of college when the aerospace companies looked at her resume, nodded politely, and hired someone whose father played golf with the hiring manager. 2 years later, she was still here, her potential leaking away like oil from a cracked pan. 20 miles away, in the gleaming tower of Meridian Industries, Blake Harrison stood at his corner office window, surveying downtown Miami like a general planning conquest. At 34, he commanded a tech empire built on his father's real estate fortune and his own ruthless ambition. The city sprawled below him in neat, profitable geometries. Luxury condos he'd helped finance, office complexes that bore his company's logo, marinas filled with toys he could afford but rarely had time to enjoy. His assistant knocked and entered without waiting. "Your Ferrari's ready for pickup. The dealership says they've finished the detailing for tomorrow's investor event." Blake nodded, straightening his Italian tie. The cherry-red 488 Jeep B wasn't just transportation. It was a statement, a piece of performance art that announced his arrival before he said a word. In his world, image wasn't everything. It was the only thing. Perception drove stock prices, board confidence, and the willingness of venture capitalists to write checks with impressive zeros. "Cancel my 3 o'clock, he said, checking his Patek Philippe. "I want to drive it myself today." He'd bought the Ferrari after closing the biggest deal of his career, a waterfront development that would displace a community but generate hundreds of millions. The guilt had lasted exactly as long as it took to calculate his commission. Blake had learned early that sentimentality was a luxury successful men couldn't afford. His father had taught him that the world divided neatly into winners and losers, and winners didn't waste time worrying about the casualties. The drive to the dealership took him through neighborhoods he rarely saw, areas where paint peeled from buildings and dreams died in installments. Blake's jaw tightened with familiar discomfort. These streets reminded him of his own past, of childhood apartments with thin walls and thinner bank accounts, before his father's big break changed everything. Success had built walls around those memories, but sometimes they leaked through. His phone buzzed with a text from his ex-wife. Jordan has a recital Thursday. Would be nice if you showed up for once. Blake deleted it without responding. Claire had left him 2 years ago, taking their 8-year-old daughter and half his assets, claiming he'd become a stranger in an expensive suit. Maybe she was right, but strangers in expensive suits didn't build empires. They built families that fell apart when the empire demanded everything. The Ferrari dealership rose ahead, all glass and gleaming chrome, a temple to automotive perfection. Blake pulled into the lot, already anticipating the satisfaction of the leather seats, the throaty roar of the V8, the way other drivers would stare with a mixture of envy and respect. He had no idea that across town, a brilliant woman with grease under her fingernails was about to teach him the difference between the price of something and its value. What assumptions do we make about people based on their appearance? And how might those first impressions blind us to who they really are? The Ferrari's engine died with a pathetic wheeze 3 blocks from the dealership. Blake sat in stunned silence as luxury cars flowed around him like water around a rock. The 488 Jeep B, his $300,000 statement of success, had become a very expensive paperweight on Biscayne Boulevard. Steam rose from beneath the hood like incense from a broken altar, and the acrid smell of overheated metal filled the cabin. "This is impossible," he muttered, jabbing the ignition button repeatedly. The engine turned over weakly, then surrendered with a mechanical sigh that sounded almost mocking. His hands gripped the leather steering wheel until his knuckles went white. The investor meeting was in 4 hours. The Ferrari wasn't just transportation. It was part of his carefully choreographed performance of power. Traffic crawled past, drivers craning their necks to stare at the smoking supercar. Blake's face burned with humiliation. In his world, breaking down was a metaphor for weakness, and weakness was blood in the water. He called the dealership, his voice tight with controlled fury. "Your car just died. I need a tow truck and a replacement immediately. Mr. Harrison, I'm so sorry. Our flatbed is out on another call, and we don't have another 488 available. Let me see what we can." Blake hung up and scrolled through his contacts, calling every luxury service in Miami. Busy. No availability. One company could help, in 6 hours. His chest tightened with the familiar pressure of losing control, of variables spiraling beyond his management. A tow truck appeared 20 minutes later, but instead of heading to the Ferrari dealership, it turned toward a part of the city Blake rarely visited, where buildings wore their age like scars and hopes were smaller, more fragile things. Jasmine heard the tow truck's rumble before she saw it, then watched with professional curiosity as it backed a cherry-red Ferrari into Martinez Auto Shop's tiny lot. The car looked obscenely out of place among the aging Hondas and work trucks, like a thoroughbred in a petting zoo. Miguel emerged from the office, wiping his hands nervously. "Customer says the engine overheated completely. Wants to know if we can take a look." Jasmine raised an eyebrow. "A Ferrari? Here." Apparently every other shop in the city is backed up. Guy seems intense. The customer stepped out of the tow truck's cab, and Jasmine immediately understood Miguel's nervousness. Blake Harrison moved like a man accustomed to bending the world to his will. Expensive suit somehow still crisp despite the Miami heat. Phone pressed to his ear, voice carrying the sharp edge of barely contained panic. "I don't care what it costs," he was saying. "I need this fixed in 3 hours." Jasmine studied the Ferrari with the reverence of someone who understood engineering excellence. Even wounded, it was beautiful, every line purposeful, every curve an equation of speed and power made manifest. Her fingers itched to explore its systems, to understand the intricate ballet of German engineering and Italian passion. Blake noticed her staring, and his expression hardened. "Excuse me, do you work here?" "I'm the mechanic," Jasmine said simply, still admiring the car. Blake's eyes swept over her, taking in the grease-stained coveralls, the natural hair pulled back in a practical ponytail, the dark skin gleaming with honest sweat. His expression shifted to barely concealed skepticism. "The mechanic? Where's the actual mechanic?" The words hit Jasmine like a physical blow, but she'd learned to armor herself against such assumptions. I am the actual mechanic. MIT Mechanical Engineering, 6 years of experience, and about a dozen Ferraris under my belt. Blake's laugh was sharp, dismissive. Look, I'm sure you're competent with regular cars, but this is a 488 GTB. It's worth more than. He caught himself, but not quickly enough. More than what? Jasmine's voice was dangerously quiet. More than I make in a year? More than I'm worth? More than someone like me could possibly understand. The air between them crackled with tension. Miguel stepped forward, hands raised peacefully. Jasmine is our best. Don't. Blake's voice cut like a blade. Just don't touch my car. I'll wait for a real shop to have availability. Jasmine felt something crack inside her chest. Not break, but fracture just enough to let the light in. She'd spent years swallowing these moments, choosing dignity over confrontation, professionalism over pride. But standing next to this beautiful, broken machine, something shifted. She walked to the Ferrari's front end and popped the hood with practiced ease. What are you doing? Blake's voice pitched higher. I said don't touch it. Jasmine ignored him, leaning over the engine bay with the focused intensity of a surgeon. The V8 was a masterpiece. Twin turbos nestled like sleeping cats, the intake manifold gleaming like jewelry. But she could see the problem immediately. A coolant hose had burst, and the engine had overheated when the cooling system failed. Simple fix, she murmured, running her finger along the damaged hose. $20 part, maybe an hour of work. Get away from my car. Blake grabbed her wrist, his grip tight enough to bruise. You have no idea what you're doing. The touch sent electricity through both of them. Not attraction, but recognition. For a split second, Blake saw something in Jasmine's eyes that made him falter. Not anger, but disappointment so profound it felt like drowning. Jasmine pulled her hand free with deliberate calm. Actually, she said, her voice steady as a heartbeat, I know exactly what I'm doing. The question is, do you want your car fixed, or do you want to be right? The moment stretched between them like a bridge neither knew how to cross. Blake stared at this woman who'd just challenged everything he thought he knew about expertise, authority, and worth. Jasmine stared back at a man whose expensive suit couldn't hide the fear in his eyes. Fear that maybe, just maybe, he wasn't always the smartest person in the room. You have 2 hours and 57 minutes, Blake said finally, his voice hoarse with reluctant surrender. Jasmine nodded once and turned back to the engine, her hands moving with the confidence of someone who'd just claimed her rightful place in the world. Blake retreated to the shop's waiting area, a collection of mismatched chairs and a coffee table held together with duct tape and hope. He perched on the edge of a cracked vinyl seat, his Italian leather shoes looking absurd against the oil-stained concrete floor. Every few minutes, his eyes drifted to the open bay where Jasmine worked, her movements precise and purposeful. This was wrong. Everything about this situation violated the natural order of his world. Mechanics were supposed to be gruff older men with beer guts and cigarette breath, not brilliant women who spoke engineering like poetry. His Ferrari, his symbol of achievement, shouldn't be in the hands of someone who… Blake's thoughts skidded to a halt. Someone who what? Was black? Was a woman? Was wearing coveralls instead of a suit? The mental completion of that sentence made his stomach turn with an uncomfortable recognition. He pulled out his phone and called his assistant. Rachel, I need you to research Martinez Auto Shop. Safety ratings, customer reviews, any complaints filed, everything. Sir, is everything okay? Just do it. He hung up and immediately called his lawyer. James, if someone damages my car during unauthorized repairs, what's my liability exposure? The questions were logical, he told himself. Due diligence. Any responsible executive would want to protect a $300,000 asset. It had nothing to do with the mechanic's skin color or gender. Nothing at all. His phone buzzed with Rachel's research. Martinez Auto Shop had excellent ratings, no complaints, and several glowing reviews specifically mentioning Jasmine's expertise with luxury vehicles. Blake stared at the screen, feeling his certainty crumble like sand. Under the hood, Jasmine fought her own battle with doubt. Her hands moved automatically, disconnecting the damaged coolant hose, measuring for the replacement. But her mind raced with the familiar demons that haunted every professional interaction. What if she was wrong? What if this wasn't just a simple coolant issue? What if years of being dismissed had made her overconfident, desperate to prove herself in ways that clouded her judgment? She could feel Blake's presence like a weight on her shoulders, his skeptical energy radiating across the shop. Every move she made felt scrutinized, judged, measured against his preconceptions. The pressure was suffocating. "You sure about this, Jazz?" Miguel appeared beside her, voice low. "That guy looks like he could buy and sell this place 10 times over. If something goes wrong..." Jasmine's hands stilled on the engine. Miguel wasn't wrong. One mistake, one accusation of incompetence or sabotage, and her reputation, already fragile in a field that questioned her every breath, could shatter completely. She thought of her mother's medical bills, her student loans, the thousand small ways the world reminded her that people like her didn't get second chances. "I know what I'm doing," she said, but the words felt hollow. "I'm just saying, maybe we should wait for the dealership. Let them handle the liability." Jasmine closed her eyes and felt the familiar weight of capitulation pressing down. It would be so easy to step back, to smile apologetically, and say this was beyond her scope. To shrink herself down to the size others expected. To apologize for taking up space she'd earned through sweat and brilliance. She opened her eyes and looked at the Ferrari's heart laid bare before her. The engine was a masterpiece of engineering precision, every component a testament to human ingenuity. It deserved better than fear. "The hose is cracked here," she called to Blake, pointing to the damaged component. Pressure buildup caused the coolant system to fail. Simple fix, but if it's not done right, you'll have the same problem in a week. Blake approached reluctantly, his expensive shoes clicking against the concrete. "How do I know you won't make it worse?" The question hung in the air like a challenge. Jasmine straightened slowly, meeting his gaze with steady eyes. "You don't. Just like I don't know if you'll pay me once the work is done, or if you'll claim I damaged something to avoid the bill, or if you'll leave negative reviews claiming I don't know what I'm doing." Blake's face flushed. "I would never. Wouldn't you?" Jasmine's voice was calm, but steel ran through it. 10 minutes ago, you assumed I couldn't possibly understand your car because of how I look. What other assumptions are you making?" The accusation hit Blake like a physical blow. He wanted to deny it, to insist his concerns were purely professional, but the words stuck in his throat. Because she was right. Every instinct screamed that this woman, this black woman in coveralls, couldn't possibly have the expertise to handle his Ferrari. And that truth made him feel sick. "This is business," he said weakly. "I'm protecting my investment. So am I." Jasmine turned back to the engine, her hands moving with renewed purpose. "I'm protecting my reputation, my livelihood, and my pride. And unlike your car, those can't be replaced with money." Blake retreated to his chair, but the waiting area felt smaller now, suffocating. His phone buzzed with messages from his office, his world continuing to spin while he sat trapped in this bubble of uncomfortable truth. Each message felt like evidence of his importance, his indispensability, reassurance that he belonged in boardrooms, not auto shops. But doubt crept in like smoke. What if his entire worldview was built on assumptions as fragile as the coolant hose now lying broken on Jasmine's workbench? What if competence and worth had nothing to do with corner offices and Italian suits? He watched Jasmine work through the glass partition, her movements confident and precise. She handled his Ferrari with more respect than he'd shown her, treating the machine like the engineering marvel it was rather than a symbol of status. Blake's chest tightened with a feeling he couldn't name, something between shame and fear, between recognition and resistance. His world was built on certainties, and this woman was dismantling them bolt by bolt. The clock on the wall ticked loudly in the silence, counting down the minutes until he'd have to choose. Cling to his assumptions or trust someone his upbringing had taught him to dismiss. Either way, Blake realized with growing dread, he was about to discover something about himself he wasn't sure he wanted to know. The Miami sky opened up without warning, transforming the afternoon into a torrential downpour that drummed against the shop's metal roof like 1,000 impatient fingers. Blake watched through the grimy window as his rideshare driver canceled, then another, then a third. The streets had become rivers, and even luxury sedans weren't immune to flooded intersections. Hurricane season, Miguel muttered, shaking his head. Comes out of nowhere and traps everyone. Blake's phone showed a wall of red on the traffic map. Every major road either flooded or gridlocked. His investor meeting had been postponed indefinitely, the downtown district effectively shut down by nature's tantrum. He was stranded, tethered to this place by weather and circumstance. How long until the storm passes? Blake asked, hating how helpless he sounded. Miguel shrugged. Could be 20 minutes, could be 3 hours. Miami weather doesn't check schedules. Through the glass partition, Blake could see Jasmine continuing her work, seemingly unbothered by the chaos outside. She'd removed the damaged coolant hose and was examining it under a work light, her brow furrowed in concentration. Water leaked through a small gap in the roof above her workspace, but she simply moved her tools and kept working. Blake's expensive suit felt increasingly ridiculous in the humid air. Sweat gathered under his collar despite the ancient air conditioning unit's valiant efforts. He loosened his tie, a small surrender that felt monumental. Coffee, Miguel offered, gesturing toward a pot that looked older than Blake's car. It's not fancy, but it's strong. Blake accepted the chipped mug gratefully, wrapping his hands around the ceramic warmth. The coffee was bitter and perfect, nothing like the artisanal blends his assistant brought him every morning. It tasted honest. Lightning flashed outside, followed by thunder that rattled the windows. The storm seemed to be settling in for a long visit, trapping predator and prey together until it decided to move on. Jasmine paused in her work, wiping sweat from her forehead with the back of her hand. The replacement hose was a perfect fit, but something nagged at her, a subtle wrongness in how the cooling system was configured. She'd seen this modification before, a factory adjustment that looked correct but created pressure points under stress. "Hey," she called to Blake, surprising herself. "Can you come here for a second?" Blake approached cautiously, coffee mug still in hand. "What is it?" "Look at this." Jasmine pointed to the coolant reservoir. "See how this line connects? It's factory spec, but there's a design flaw. Under extreme conditions, say Miami traffic in July, the system can't handle the pressure buildup." Blake leaned closer, breathing in the scent of motor oil and something else, something clean and warm that might have been her shampoo. "I don't understand. Are you saying Ferrari designed it wrong?" "Not wrong exactly. Just not optimized for real-world conditions." Jasmine's finger traced the cooling lines. "It's like designing a suit for air conditioning, but never considering what happens when you step outside." The metaphor hit Blake uncomfortably close to home. "So what are you suggesting?" "I can do the simple fix, replace the hose and get you running. You'll be fine for a while, maybe even a year if you're careful about when and how you drive." Jasmine turned to face him, her dark eyes serious. "Or I can redesign the routing. It'll take longer, cost more, but your car will run better than it ever has." Blake stared at her, processing the offer. "You would do that? Improve on Ferrari's design?" "It's what I do." A small smile played at the corners of Jasmine's mouth. "When people let me." The simple statement carried weight that made Blake's chest tight. He found himself studying her face, the intelligence in her eyes, the confidence in her posture, the competence that radiated from her like heat from an engine. When had he stopped seeing her as a threat and started seeing her as what? A person, an expert, something more dangerous than either? "Why?" Blake asked quietly. "Why would you go to that trouble for someone who assumed I was incompetent because of how I look?" Jasmine's voice was gentle, without accusation. "Because the car deserves it. And because proving you wrong isn't the same as helping you." Thunder crashed overhead again, and the lights flickered. Miguel cursed from his office as his computer screen went dark. The storm was intensifying, turning their temporary shelter into something more intimate and inescapable. Blake set his coffee mug on the workbench, his hands trembling slightly. "I owe you an apology." "You owe me respect," Jasmine corrected. "Apologies are words. Respect is action." "Then show me," Blake said, surprising them both. "Show me what you'd do differently." Jasmine hesitated. This was the moment when good judgment should have prevailed, when she should have done the simple fix and sent him on his way. But something in his voice, vulnerability mixed with genuine curiosity, made her reach for her tablet instead. "Okay," she said, pulling up a schematic. "But you have to listen. Really listen. Not just wait for your turn to talk, or look for reasons to doubt me. Can you do that?" Blake nodded, then caught himself. "I can try. That's all anyone can do." As Jasmine began explaining the cooling system modifications, her passion for the work transformed her. She gestured animatedly, her voice taking on the rhythm of someone sharing a language they loved. Blake found himself leaning closer, not just to hear over the storm, but because her enthusiasm was magnetic. For the first time in years, Blake felt like a student rather than the smartest person in the room. It was terrifying and exhilarating in equal measure. Outside, the storm raged on, keeping them bound together in this pocket of unexpected intimacy where prejudice met competence and neither would emerge unchanged. "You know what the real problem is?" Jasmine said, gesturing at the Ferrari's engine bay. "Everyone thinks engineering is about making things perfect. But perfect for who? For what conditions?" Blake watched her hands move across the components, explaining how she'd reroute the coolant lines for better efficiency. "What do you mean? This car was designed for European roads, European weather, European driving patterns. But you live in Miami." Jasmine's fingers traced the air, sketching invisible pathways. Heat, humidity, stop-and-go traffic. Ferrari's engineers probably never sat in a traffic jam on I-95 in August. So they designed it wrong. They designed it for their world, not yours. Jasmine's voice carried a weight that had nothing to do with automotive engineering. "Happens more than you'd think." Blake studied her profile as she worked, noting the way her brow furrowed in concentration, the unconscious grace of her movements. "You sound like you have experience with that." Jasmine's hands stilled. For a moment, the only sound was rain drumming against the roof and the distant rumble of thunder. "MIT," she said finally. "Full scholarship, top of my class, published 3 papers on thermal dynamics before I graduated." "That's impressive." "You sound surprised." Blake felt heat rise in his cheeks. "I just meant. I know what you meant." Jasmine's voice was gentle but firm. 6 months of job hunting after graduation. 47 applications, 12 interviews, 0 offers. Want to guess why? Blake's throat felt dry. He knew why, but saying it aloud would make him complicit in something he'd pretended not to see his entire career. "Cultural fit," Jasmine continued, her voice taking on a bitter edge. "Not what we're looking for right now. We'll keep your resume on file. Standard corporate speak for, you don't look like what we picture when we imagine an engineer." She moved to her workbench and pulled out a worn folder, extracting a photograph. "This was my senior project team at MIT." Blake looked at the image, 5 students standing around a prototype engine, beaming with accomplishment. Jasmine was the only woman, the only person of color. Even in the photograph, she seemed to occupy less space, as if the camera itself couldn't quite believe she belonged. "We designed a hybrid cooling system that increased efficiency by 30%, Jasmine said, pride and pain warring in her voice. "My idea, my calculations, my breakthrough. 3 of my teammates got job offers from the companies that attended our presentation. Want to guess which 2 didn't?" Blake stared at the photograph, seeing not just the young woman's face, but the hope in her eyes. Hope that would be systematically crushed by a world that couldn't see past her skin color to her brilliance. "That's when I learned the difference between being smart and being heard," Jasmine continued. "Between having the right answers and having the right look." Thunder crashed overhead, and Blake jumped slightly. The storm outside seemed to mirror the turbulence he felt inside, a lifetime of assumptions being torn apart by winds he couldn't control. What about you? Jasmine asked, her tone shifting. You build some kind of empire, drive a car worth more than most people's houses. Always been this successful. Blake's laugh was hollow. Not even close. He found himself sitting on a nearby stool, the physical distance between them somehow making emotional honesty easier. Grew up in Hialeah. Dad worked construction. Mom cleaned office buildings. We lived in a one-bedroom apartment where the Roaches had better credit than us. Jasmine turned to face him fully, her expression shifting from wariness to curiosity. Dad got lucky, bought a small property just before the neighborhood gentrified. Sold it for 10 times what he paid, used the money to flip houses. Blake's voice grew distant. Suddenly we had money. Nice house, private school, country club membership. Dad wanted me to forget where we came from. Did you? The question hit Blake like a physical blow. I tried to. God, I tried so hard. He rubbed his face with both hands. College, business school, networking events where everyone looked the same and thought the same thoughts. I learned to talk like them, dress like them, think like them. But sometimes I'd catch myself in the mirror and see my father's hands, my mother's eyes. The ones that knew what it felt like to be invisible. Blake's voice cracked slightly. So I built walls. Expensive walls. Italian suits, German cars, Swiss watches, armor to prove I belonged. Jasmine set down her tools and really looked at him for the first time. Beneath the expensive facade, she saw something familiar. The exhaustion of constantly proving yourself, the weight of carrying others' expectations while burying your own truth. The Ferrari, she said quietly. It's not transportation. No, it's proof. Proof that the kid from Hialeah made it. Proof that I deserve to be in rooms where decisions get made. Blake met her eyes. But you know what's funny? The more I proved I belonged, the less I felt like myself. And the less like yourself you felt, the easier it became to dismiss people like me. Blake winced. I became everything I once feared. Someone who judges worth by appearance, who assumes intelligence comes with the right pedigree. He looked at his hands, soft and uncalloused compared to hers. My ex-wife used to say I'd turned into a stranger wearing my face. Smart woman. Yeah, too smart to stay married to who I became. Lightning illuminated the shop in stark white, and for a moment they sat in the strange intimacy of shared confessions. Two people from different worlds who'd both paid prices for success. Hers denied despite her brilliance, his achieved by sacrificing his soul. Why are you telling me this? Jasmine asked. Blake was quiet for a long moment, listening to the rain. Because you're the first person in years who's seen through the suit to the scared kid underneath. And because, he paused, struggling with words. Because watching you work, seeing your passion for what you do, it reminds me of who I used to be before I decided being myself wasn't good enough. Jasmine felt something shift in her chest, a wall she'd built around her heart developing its first crack. This wasn't the arrogant CEO who'd grabbed her wrist and dismissed her expertise. This was someone as wounded by the world's expectations as she was, just wounded differently. The hardest part, she said softly, is never knowing if you're not getting opportunities because you're not good enough or because they can't see past your skin to your capabilities. And the hardest part for me, Blake replied, is realizing I became part of the system that makes you question yourself. Outside, the storm began to ease, but neither of them noticed. They were too busy examining the wreckage of assumptions, seeing each other clearly for the first time. How well do we really know the people we make snap judgments about? And what stories might they be carrying that could change our perspective entirely? The rain had softened to a gentle patter, but Blake made no move to check his phone for ride availability. Instead, he found himself genuinely curious about the cooling system modifications Jasmine was explaining, asking questions not to challenge her expertise, but to understand it. So you're essentially creating a secondary circuit? He asked, leaning over the engine bay beside her. Exactly. See how this connects here. Jasmine's finger traced the path she'd mapped out. It'll handle the excess pressure when the primary system gets overwhelmed. like having a relief valve for stress. Blake smiled, the first genuine smile he'd worn all day. Sounds like something I could use in my office. Pressure relief? Jasmine glanced at him with amusement. Let me guess, you're one of those guys who thinks 18-hour days prove dedication. Guilty. Blake's laugh was self-deprecating. My assistant has to remind me to eat lunch. I used to think that made me impressive. What do you think now? Blake considered the question seriously. Now I think it makes me scared. Scared that if I slow down for even a minute, someone will realize I don't belong. Jasmine straightened, wiping her hands on a rag. You know what's funny? I work twice as hard as anyone else in this shop, stay twice as late, double-check everything twice. Same fear, different reason. The fear that they'll say you're not good enough. The fear that they'll say they were right about people like me all along. They stood in comfortable silence for a moment, both recognizing the exhausting weight of constantly proving themselves. Blake watched Jasmine work with the precision of a surgeon and the passion of an artist, and wondered how many other brilliant people he'd dismissed over the years because they didn't fit his narrow definition of expertise. Can I ask you something? Blake said. When you first saw me today, before I opened my mouth and proved what an ass I could be, what did you think? Jasmine tilted her head, considering. Honestly, I thought you looked lost, scared and trying to hide it with expensive armor. She smiled softly. I recognized it because I do the same thing, just with different tools. Different tools. Competence. I make myself so obviously good at what I do that people can't ignore me. It's exhausting, but it works. Usually. Blake felt something loosen in his chest. A knot of tension he'd carried so long he'd forgotten it was there. What would it feel like, do you think? To just be ourselves. Terrifying, Jasmine said immediately, then laughed. But maybe worth it. Miguel emerged from his office, shaking water from his umbrella. Rain stopping. Roads should clear up in another hour or so. Blake felt an unexpected pang of disappointment. The storm had created this bubble outside normal time and space, where he could be curious instead of commanding, vulnerable instead of victorious. Soon he'd have to step back into his world of quarterly reports and power lunches, where admitting uncertainty was weakness and asking questions revealed ignorance. Before that happens, Blake said quietly, would you show me how to do what you're doing? I mean, really show me, not just explain it. Jasmine raised an eyebrow. You want to get your hands dirty? I used to help my dad with his truck when I was a kid, before we had money to pay other people to fix our problems. Blake looked down at his manicured hands. I miss knowing how things work. Without a word, Jasmine handed him a wrench. Okay, but we do this right. No shortcuts, no pretending you understand something when you don't. Deal. For the next 40 minutes, Blake learned what it meant to listen, really listen, without agenda or superiority. Jasmine guided his hands as he removed the old coolant line, her patience infinite when he struggled with concepts that were second nature to her. She didn't talk down to him or rush past his questions, treating his ignorance as an opportunity rather than a burden. Feel that resistance? Jasmine asked as Blake carefully threaded a new fitting. That's the metal telling you something. Listen to it. Blake paused, focusing on the subtle feedback through the wrench. It wants to turn, but not forced. Exactly. Respect the metal, and it'll cooperate. Fight it, and you'll strip the threads. Is that how you approach everything? Pretty much. Cars, people, problems, they all respond better to understanding than force. Blake thought about his own leadership style, built on dominance and control rather than collaboration and respect. I think I've been stripping a lot of threads in my life. Threads can be repaired, Jasmine said gently, if you care enough to do it right. When they finished installing the new cooling system, both of them were streaked with grease and grinning like conspirators. Blake's expensive shirt was ruined, his perfectly styled hair disheveled, and he couldn't remember the last time he'd felt so accomplished. Fire it up, Jasmine said, gesturing toward the driver's seat. Blake slid behind the wheel, his hands trembling slightly with anticipation. The Ferrari's engine turned over smoothly, then settled into a purr that was noticeably different, quieter, more confident, somehow more alive. "Listen to that," Jasmine said with obvious pride. 15 degrees cooler at idle, better pressure distribution throughout the system. "Your car will thank you for this." Blake stepped out and looked at the engine bay, seeing not just a machine but a collaboration. His curiosity and her expertise working together to create something better than either could have achieved alone. "Thank you," he said, and the words carried weight beyond automotive repair. "Not just for fixing the car. For seeing something in me worth teaching." Jasmine's smile was warm and genuine. "Thank you for being willing to learn. And for reminding me that not everyone who makes assumptions is irredeemable." They stood there as afternoon light filtered through the clearing clouds, both knowing that something fundamental had shifted between them. The CEO and the mechanic had become simply Blake and Jasmine, two people who'd found unexpected common ground in the honest work of making broken things whole. Blake's phone buzzed with notifications from his office, the outside world demanding his attention. But for just a moment longer, he allowed himself to exist in this space where worth was measured by curiosity rather than conquest, where connection mattered more than control. "I should probably get going," he said reluctantly. "Probably," Jasmine agreed, but neither of them moved. The fragile bridge they'd built felt too precious to abandon, too rare to risk in the harsh light of their separate realities. But storms end, and people return to their lives, carrying only memories of what briefly felt possible. Blake's phone erupted with an urgent ringtone, his business partner's number flashing across the screen. The sound shattered the intimate quiet like glass hitting concrete. "I have to take this," he said apologetically, stepping toward the waiting area. "Blake Harrison, where the hell have you been?" The voice was loud enough for Jasmine to hear from across the shop. "The Meridian deal is falling apart. Investors are asking questions about that community displacement story. We need damage control now." Blake's expression shifted like a mask sliding into place. His shoulders squared. His voice took on the crisp authority Jasmine had heard when he first arrived. "What kind of questions?" "The bleeding heart kind. Someone leaked details about the families we're relocating. Now there's a petition with 50,000 signatures calling us predators." Jasmine tried to focus on cleaning her tools, but the conversation pulled at her attention. Meridian, she'd seen that name in the news. The luxury development that was forcing out 3 generations of families from Liberty City, one of Miami's historic black neighborhoods. "Listen to me carefully," Blake said, his voice dropping to the cold calculation Jasmine had heard earlier. "We followed every legal requirement. Those people are being fairly compensated for market value. Market value for properties they've lived in for decades." The voice crackled through the speaker. "Properties that were deliberately undervalued through systematic disinvestment. You know how this looks." Blake glanced toward Jasmine, then turned away. "Perception isn't reality, Marcus. We're providing opportunities for economic development. Sometimes progress requires difficult decisions." Jasmine's hands stilled on her wrench. The word progress hit her like a slap. How many times had she heard that euphemism used to justify bulldozing communities that looked like hers? How many families had been displaced in the name of development and improvement? "The community activist is giving interviews," Marcus continued. "Says we're erasing history, breaking up families. It's going viral." "Then we control the narrative," Blake said sharply. "Schedule a press conference. I'll talk about job creation, tax revenue, urban renewal. Make it about economic opportunity, not displacement." Jasmine stepped closer, unable to help herself. "Liberty City?" she asked quietly. Blake covered the phone. "It's complicated business stuff. My grandmother lived in Liberty City," Jasmine said, her voice steady but her eyes burning. "Raised 6 kids in a house my grandfather built with his own hands. Paid taxes for 40 years, watched the neighborhood schools get defunded, the clinics close, the grocery stores leave. Then developers like you showed up calling it economic opportunity." Blake's face went pale. "Jasmine, what happened to her house?" Jasmine's voice was deceptively calm, the way storm fronts move in slowly before unleashing devastation. Blake looked at the phone in his hand, then at Jasmine's face. The mask was cracking, but the machine of his empire demanded answers. We offered fair market value. Legal compensation. No one was forced. What happened to her house? Blake's throat felt like sandpaper. It was demolished last month. But the family was relocated to a nice apartment complex with modern amenities. Demolished. The word fell from Jasmine's lips like a stone into still water. You tore down my grandmother's house. The silence stretched between them, broken only by Marcus's tinny voice still squawking from the phone. Blake, are you there? We need to move on this now. Jasmine turned away, her movements mechanical as she began gathering her tools. Get out. Jasmine, please. Let me explain. Explain what? She whirled to face him, and Blake saw something die in her eyes. The warmth, the tentative trust, the possibility of connection. Explain how you profit from destroying communities? How you call it progress when you erase people's histories? How you sleep at night counting money made from other people's pain? It's not that simple. It's exactly that simple. Jasmine's voice cracked like a whip. You sit in your tower making decisions about neighborhoods you've never lived in, families you've never met. You reduce people's lives to spreadsheet entries and call it business. Blake felt the walls of his old self rising around him like floodwaters. You don't understand the economics. I understand plenty. Jasmine's laugh was bitter as broken glass. I understand that you learned to work with your hands today, got your expensive shirt dirty, and felt good about connecting with the common people. Made you feel real, didn't it? Authentic. That's not. But tomorrow you'll go back to your office and sign more papers, approve more demolitions, displace more families. And you'll tell yourself it's progress. Blake's business instincts kicked in, the part of him trained to defend, deflect, rationalize. Those properties were deteriorating. We're bringing investment to areas that need. That need what? Need you to save them from themselves. Jasmine's voice rose to a shout. My grandmother's house was deteriorating because your kind of investment made sure the city never fixed the infrastructure, never funded the schools, never provided services. You starved the neighborhood for decades, then showed up to feast on the corpse. We're creating jobs. For who? Your construction crews? Your property managers? You think anyone from Liberty City is going to be able to afford rent in your luxury towers? Blake felt cornered, defensive, all the progress of the afternoon crumbling like sand. We followed the law. We paid fair compensation. We can't be responsible for every historical injustice. Historical? Jasmine's voice went deadly quiet. You think this is historical? You demolished my grandmother's house 3 weeks ago. She's been staying with my mother ever since, crying every night because she doesn't understand why strangers could take away the place where she raised her children. The words hit Blake like physical blows. In his mind, the Liberty City project had been abstract, numbers on reports, zoning maps, profit projections. He'd never considered the grandmother who lost her garden, the children who lost their playground, the families torn from roots that ran generations deep. I didn't know, he whispered. You didn't want to know, Jasmine shot back. It's easier to destroy people when they're just statistics. Blake's phone was still buzzing with calls, his empire demanding attention, but all he could see was the devastation in Jasmine's eyes. The woman who'd trusted him enough to teach him, who'd seen past his assumptions to something worth saving, now looked at him like he was everything wrong with the world. I'm not a monster, Blake said desperately. I'm trying to build something, create value. You are exactly what I thought you were when you walked in here, Jasmine said, her voice flat with finality. A rich man who thinks his money gives him the right to decide other people's fates. I just forgot for a few hours because you got grease under your fingernails. She turned back to her workbench, dismissing him as completely as he'd initially dismissed her. Your car's fixed. Miguel will handle the payment. Get out of my shop. Blake stood frozen, watching the bridge between them collapse in real time. Everything they'd built, the understanding, the connection, the possibility of something more, lay in ruins around his feet. The storm had passed, but it had left devastation in its wake. Marcus's voice crackled from the forgotten phone. "Blake? The press conference is in an hour. We need talking points about community benefits." Blake looked at the phone, then at Jasmine's rigid back, then at his own reflection in the shop window. He saw a stranger in an expensive suit, a man who'd learned to fix engines but forgotten how to fix the damage he caused to lives. The choice was simple: his empire or his soul, his wealth or his humanity, his carefully constructed identity or the man he'd glimpsed in Jasmine's eyes before she learned who he really was. Blake picked up the phone and walked toward the door, each step taking him further from the person he'd almost remembered how to be. "I'm on my way," he told Marcus, his voice hollow as an empty shell. Behind him, Jasmine didn't turn around, but her shoulders shook once, briefly, before she forced them steady again. The afternoon sun had returned, bright and merciless, burning away the last traces of the storm that had brought them together and the revelation that tore them apart. Blake sat in his Ferrari in the Meridian Industries parking garage, the engine running perfectly thanks to Jasmine's modifications. The irony wasn't lost on him, her brilliance making his machine more efficient while he'd helped destroy her family's foundation. The leather seats that had once felt like victory now felt like a prison. His phone buzzed relentlessly. Marcus, the board of directors, investors demanding explanations. The carefully orchestrated press conference was in 30 minutes, and Blake had the talking points memorized: job creation, economic revitalization, urban renewal. Words designed to obscure rather than illuminate, to justify rather than heal. He caught his reflection in the rearview mirror and barely recognized the man staring back. When had his eyes become so cold? When had success required him to stop seeing the people his decisions affected? Blake pulled out his tablet and scrolled through the Liberty City files he'd never bothered to examine closely. Property records, demolition schedules, relocation payments, all efficiently cataloged. But now he saw them differently. Each address wasn't just a number, it was someone's grandmother's house, someone's childhood bedroom, someone's roots being systematically severed in the name of progress. He found the address, 847 Northwest 62nd Street, Jasmine's grandmother's house. The property record showed a modest two-bedroom built in 1962, owned by the same family for 60 years. The demolition photos showed a small house with a carefully tended garden, children's toys in the yard, a life interrupted. Blake's chest tightened as he scrolled through the relocation paperwork. The fair market value payment was a fraction of what his company would charge for a month's rent in the luxury towers they were building on the same ground. Legal? Yes. Moral? The question felt like a knife twisting in his gut. 30 blocks away, Jasmine sat on her apartment balcony, staring at the Miami skyline where towers like Blake's rose like glass monuments to other people's displacement. Her grandmother's voice drifted from inside, a phone conversation with an old neighbor who'd also been relocated. Both women trying to make sense of a world that no longer had space for their history. "The garden," her grandmother was saying. 60 years I tended those tomatoes. Taught your mother to plant them, taught you. Now they build swimming pools where my vegetables grew." Jasmine closed her eyes, remembering summer afternoons in that garden, her small hands learning to distinguish weeds from wisdom, her grandmother's stories blooming alongside the collard greens. The house hadn't just been shelter. It had been legacy, continuity, proof that their family belonged somewhere. She'd known Blake was wealthy, powerful. But she'd let herself believe that underneath the expensive armor was someone capable of growth, of seeing beyond his privileged perspective. For a few hours, working side by side over the Ferrari's engine, she'd thought she'd found someone who could understand that worth wasn't measured in dollars. Instead, she'd discovered she was teaching automotive repair to the man who'd bulldozed her family's foundation. Jasmine's phone buzzed with a text from Miguel. Customer left payment and something else. You should see this. She almost ignored it. Whatever Blake had left, probably a guilty overpayment or some hollow apology note, couldn't undo the harm. Nothing could bring back her grandmother's house or restore the community he'd helped destroy. But something made her walk back to the shop. Blake stood at the podium in Meridian's media room, looking out at the assembled reporters. The talking points felt like ash in his mouth. Behind the cameras, Marcus gave him an encouraging thumbs up, confident that Blake would perform his role as the visionary developer bringing prosperity to struggling neighborhoods. "Ladies and gentlemen," Blake began, his voice steady despite the storm raging inside him. "Thank you for coming today to discuss the Liberty City Renewal Project." The words were supposed to flow automatically, the carefully crafted narrative about investment and opportunity. But instead, Blake saw Jasmine's grandmother crying in her daughter's house, displaced at 83 because men in suits had decided her life's work wasn't worth preserving. This project represents. Blake paused, staring at the sea of expectant faces. In the back of the room, a young woman held up her phone, live streaming to thousands of followers. Among the viewers might be people from Liberty City, families still fighting displacement, grandmothers still mourning their gardens. This project represents. Blake's voice faltered. The teleprompter scrolled with words about progress and prosperity, but all he could hear was Jasmine's voice. "You reduce people's lives to spreadsheet entries and call it business." Marcus stepped forward, concern creasing his features. The reporters leaned forward, sensing a crack in the corporate facade. Blake thought about the man he'd been in that auto shop. Curious instead of commanding, vulnerable instead of victorious. That man had learned something about respect, about listening to wisdom regardless of its packaging. That man had felt more authentic in grease-stained clothes than Blake had ever felt in Italian suits. "I'm sorry," Blake said quietly, then louder. "I'm sorry." The room erupted in confused murmurs. Marcus's face went white. "I'm sorry to the families we displaced," Blake continued, his voice gaining strength. "I'm sorry to the grandmothers who lost their gardens, the children who lost their playgrounds, the communities that lost their history, that we called it progress. But progress that erases people isn't progress at all." "Blake." Marcus hissed from the side of the stage, but Blake had found his voice, not the polished corporate speaker, but the man who'd remembered what it felt like to create instead of destroy. "We can do better," Blake said, looking directly into the cameras. "We will do better. This project ends today. Every family will be offered the choice to return to their land, and we'll work with the community to build something together instead of imposed upon them." The room exploded. Reporters shouted questions. Marcus stormed the stage. Board members frantically worked their phones. But Blake felt something he hadn't experienced in years. The terrifying freedom of choosing conscience over profit. He walked off the stage, ignoring the chaos behind him, and headed for his car. He had a choice to make, his empire or his soul. And for the first time in years, Blake Harrison knew exactly who he wanted to be. Jasmine stared at the envelope Miguel had handed her, her name written in Blake's precise handwriting. Inside wasn't money or an apology note. It was a property deed, 847 Northwest 62nd Street, Liberty City. Her grandmother's address. Attached was a simple note. "Some things are worth more than money. Some people deserve better than my excuses. The choice is yours." Her phone buzzed with a news alert. Meridian CEO halts controversial development, promises community partnership. Jasmine's hands trembled as she read the article, watching Blake's press conference footage. She saw the moment his corporate mask cracked, revealing the man she'd glimpsed in the auto shop, uncertain, vulnerable, but finally, desperately honest. The choice was hers now. Trust the gesture or dismiss it as another manipulation. Believe people could change or accept that some bridges, once burned, couldn't be rebuilt. Jasmine looked at the property deed, then at her phone showing Blake's face as he walked away from everything he'd built. For the first time since the afternoon had shattered, she allowed herself to hope that maybe, just maybe, some storms cleared the air instead of just destroying what came before. 3 months later, Blake's hands were permanently stained with grease. He knelt in the red dirt of what had once been his luxury development site, now transformed into a community garden where children played between rows of collard greens and tomatoes. His expensive suits had been replaced by work clothes that bore honest dirt. His corner office traded for a folding table under a tent where he met with community leaders about affordable housing plans designed with residents, not imposed upon them. The financial cost had been devastating. Blake's board had fired him within hours of the press conference, his investors had fled, and his personal fortune had evaporated in lawsuits and contract cancellations. But sitting in the garden where Mrs. Williams, Jasmine's grandmother, taught neighborhood children how to distinguish weeds from wisdom, Blake felt richer than he'd ever been in his glass tower. "You're doing it wrong," a familiar voice said behind him. Blake turned to find Jasmine watching him struggle with a stubborn bolt on the community center's water pump. She wore coveralls and a guarded expression, but something in her eyes had softened since their first encounter. "Story of my life lately," Blake said with a self-deprecating smile. "Turns out there's a lot I don't know about building things instead of tearing them down." Jasmine approached cautiously, like someone approaching a wounded animal that might still bite. "Let me see." She knelt beside him, her shoulder brushing his as she examined the pump mechanism. The contact sent electricity through both of them, different from that first angry touch, but equally charged with possibility. "Wrong wrench," Jasmine diagnosed. "You need something that can handle the torque without stripping the threads." "Respect the metal," Blake said quietly, remembering her lesson from the Ferrari repair. "You remember." "I remember everything about that day, including the moment I chose my empire over my conscience." Blake's hands stilled on the wrench. "I've replayed it 1,000 times, wondering if I could have made a different choice sooner." Jasmine was quiet for a long moment, watching children chase butterflies between the garden rows. "My grandmother wants to meet you," she said finally. Blake's head snapped up. "She does. She says any man willing to give up everything to return what was stolen deserves a chance to explain himself." Jasmine's voice was carefully neutral. "She also says you looked lost in that press conference, like a little boy who finally told the truth and didn't know what to do next." "She's not wrong. Are you? Lost, I mean." Blake considered the question seriously. "Not lost. Learning. Learning what it means to build something with people instead of despite them. Learning that being right isn't the same as being good. Learning that some bridges are worth crossing even when you're terrified of what's on the other side." Jasmine adjusted the wrench in his hands, her fingers guiding his to the correct position. "And what's on the other side?" "You," Blake said simply. "The possibility of you. Of us. Of becoming someone worthy of the woman who saw potential in a privileged fool and tried to teach him how to listen." The pump mechanism clicked into alignment with a satisfying mechanical harmony. Water began flowing through the pipes, and children's laughter erupted from the nearby playground as the drinking fountain came to life. "I'm not the same person who fixed your car," Jasmine said, settling back on her heels. "That day broke something in me. Made me question whether I can trust my judgment about people." "Good," Blake said, surprising her. "I hope it did break something. Because the version of me that walked into your shop needed to be dismantled completely before anything real could be built." Jasmine studied his face, noting the lines of exhaustion around his eyes, the calluses forming on his hands, the way he looked at the community garden with genuine pride rather than ownership. "This isn't easy for you. Nothing worthwhile ever is. You taught me that too." Blake stood, offering his hand to help her up. "The Ferrari still running well?" Jasmine accepted his hand, allowing him to pull her to her feet. "Like a dream. Your cars never run better." "Neither have I." They stood in the afternoon light, hands still connected, both aware that every choice from this moment forward would determine whether the bridge between them could be rebuilt on a foundation of honesty rather than assumptions. "Grandmother's making dinner Sunday," Jasmine said. "She's cooking in her old kitchen, the one you helped give back to her. And you, what are you cooking up?" Jasmine's smile was tentative but real. "A second chance. Maybe. If you can prove you understand the difference between earning something and deserving it." "What's the difference?" "Earning is about what you accomplish. Deserving is about who you become." Blake looked around the garden, At the children playing where luxury towers would have stood, at the grandmother teaching young hands to nurture growth instead of extraction, at the woman whose expertise had humbled his arrogance and whose forgiveness might redeem his soul. "Then I have work to do," he said. "We both do." As the sun set over Miami, painting the sky in shades of possibility, Blake and Jasmine worked side by side to finish repairs on the community center. Their conversations flowed like the water through newly fixed pipes, tentative at first, then stronger, finding their natural rhythm. When Mrs. Williams called them in for sweet tea and stories about the neighborhood's history, Blake listened with the attention of a student rather than the impatience of a conqueror. And when Jasmine laughed at his grandmother's gentle teasing about his clumsy gardening technique, the sound felt like music after a long silence. Later, as they walked to their cars under stars barely visible above the city's glow, Jasmine stopped beside Blake's Ferrari, still cherry red, still beautiful, but somehow transformed by everything that had happened since that stormy afternoon. "You could have kept everything," she said. "Your company, your money, your comfortable life. Why give it all up?" Blake touched the Ferrari's hood, remembering the day Jasmine's hands had first shown him what it meant to truly fix something. "Because I finally understood the difference between the price of something and its value." "And what's the value?" "You. This." Blake gestured to the garden, the community center, the possibility of building something beautiful together. The chance to earn a place in a world worth living in. Jasmine moved closer, close enough that Blake could see the grease still smudged on her cheek, the hope cautiously blooming in her eyes. "It's going to take time. Trust doesn't rebuild overnight." "I know. And work. Real work, not just gestures. I'm counting on it. And humility. Lots of humility." Blake's smile was genuine, unguarded, bearing no resemblance to the corporate mask he'd worn for so many years. "Luckily, I know an excellent teacher." Jasmine reached up and traced the grease stain on his shirt, evidence of honest labor, of hands learning to create rather than destroy. Lucky indeed. As they stood in the gentle Miami evening, two people who'd found each other across the wreckage of assumptions and the promise of redemption, Blake realized that some storms don't just reveal who we are. They wash away everything we thought we had to be, leaving space for who we might become. The Ferrari's engine purred with Jasmine's modifications, running better than Blake had ever imagined possible. Just like his heart. What does it truly mean to change? And how do we learn to value the people and connections that transform us from the inside out?